Hey everyone, so in this video, I'm going to do a quick and to-the-point review of the VENUS Optics Laowa 15mm shift lens. Okay, so fair warning first, I'm not going to go into some crazy in-depth overview over every single aspect of this lens. In fact, let's fast forward to what most people will mention at the end of a review. Do I recommend this lens? Yes and no. And I'm going to speak specifically to architecture photographers here, and maybe even lump in landscape photographers, because lenses that shift generally, they tend to be more geared for architecture and landscape photographers. Okay, so if you already have the Nikon 19mm tilt shift lens or the Canon 17mm tilt shift lens, then I see absolutely no reason to run out and go grab this lens. Aside from a slightly wider focal length, there's really no difference in quality or anything else for that matter. Now, that aside, if you do not have either the Nikon or the Canon tilt shift lens, and you've been kicking around the idea of potentially getting an ultra wide angle shift lens, then 100% I would recommend the Laowa. The biggest reason is obviously the price. Right now on B&H, Amazon, and Autorama, this lens runs about $1,200. And yes, I realize $1,200 is not cheap. But the Canon 17mm tilt shift lens runs about $950 more than the Laowa. And if I'm looking at things right, and I like to think that I am, the Nikon tilt shift lens runs about $2,000 more than this one. Now, I understand as professional photographers, whenever you hear a price difference of that much, typically you raise an eyebrow and you look at this lens and you wonder, well, why in the world is this one so cheap? Well, I think the biggest reason and answer is what's missing in the product name. The VENUS Optics Laowa is a shift lens, whereas the other ones I mentioned are tilt shift lenses. This one has no tilt functionality whatsoever. And as architecture photographers, I would venture to say most, if not all, would be perfectly fine not having the tilt feature in a lens like this if it meant it would help out significantly on the price, and that's what Laowa did. And with that in mind, you got to give Laowa a lot of credit here. They were willing to manufacture a lens for an extremely specific niche of photography. Think of it, it's really not that much of a risk for a lens manufacturer to put out a, say, 35mm prime, because they know that kind of lens can be used across multiple genres of photography. Now, a lens manufacturer creates a tilt shift lens, and you're essentially narrowing it down to architecture, landscape, and product photographers. Take away the tilt function, and now you've pretty much lost product photographers altogether. So again, big thumbs up and kudos to Laowa for even putting out this lens. So what about the quality of the lens itself and the images it captures? It's great. In today's day and age where weirdos on social media like myself, we create videos where they'll pick apart and dissect every single aspect of a new product that a manufacturer puts out there. I don't think specifically a lens manufacturer, the chances of them putting out a bad lens is slim to none. Now, that being said, if you take a similar shot with this lens and put it up against, say, either the Canon or the Nikon tilt shift lenses, will you notice a difference? Again, aside from the slightly wider focal length, initially, I really don't think so. But blow up the images to 400% in post, analyze the color under a microscope, and pixel peep the heck out of it, yeah, you're gonna notice some difference. I mean, don't get me wrong, this lens isn't perfect. Shoot, Laowa even claims there's absolutely zero distortion with this lens, and in reality, there's a little bit, but it really only pops up when you shift all the way one direction or the other. Here's the thing. Most of the nitpicks that photographers have with this lens, like variance in contrast, slight vignetting, difference in sharpness compared to one lens versus the other, they are all extremely easy fixes in the post-production process. And the ironic thing is, you'll see some of the same exact issues in some of the other shift lenses. So unless you are delivering straight out of camera images to your clients, I really don't think some of the, albeit subtle, issues some photographers have with this lens, I really don't view them as deal breakers. I liken it to when I see tech-centric YouTube videos where they're analyzing and reviewing the new iPhone, and specifically they'll talk about the finish and the color of the new phone and how much they either love or hate it. But yet, in reality, most of us, when we get the new phone, we're gonna slap a case or a cover on it anyway. Okay, so let's get to some of the pros and cons of this lens. We'll start with the cons. Con number one, it is 100% manual. There's no autofocus, and even the aperture has to be adjusted on the lens itself. You can't do it from the camera body. Con number two, there's no data about the lens that's transferred over to the metadata in the image files. So you're not gonna see things like what manufacturer the lens was or at what focal length the image was taken at. Con number three, now I'm not gonna use the word bad because in my opinion that's too extreme of a word, but I would say the slightly lower quality images come from shooting at the widest aperture on this lens, which is 4.5, and shifting pretty far in one direction or another. But as architecture photographers, I really don't think there's many situations where we're gonna need to shoot a subject or a space at a 4.5 aperture. Con number four. Now some photographers would say that the Canon tilt shift lens is sharper, but the difference is so minimal. Any side-by-side examples that you're gonna see are when the images are blown up to 1,000,000%. Con number five, and this is my personal biggest issue I have with this lens, is the round or bulbous front glass element. Unfortunately, because of the glass element sticking out further than the body of the lens, it doesn't really lend itself with the ability to use filters on it. And you're gonna need to be extra careful to make sure that the front element doesn't get scratched. Okay, let's get to the pros. It's mostly metallic, it feels stout, it has some weight to it, and when things lock and click into place on this lens, it feels solid. Number two, overall size. This lens is much more compact than many of the other lenses it's compared to. And again, I think the biggest reason is because there's no tilt functionality mechanics built into it. Number three, I mentioned it before, but for the most part, no lens distortion, unless you shift pretty far in one direction and then a little bit gets introduced, but again, an extremely easy fix in post. Number four, if you are an architecture photographer and you typically play within that f8 to f11 sandbox, this is where you are going to get the absolutely best looking photos. The images are fantastic. Number five, Laowa makes these lenses specifically for Canon, Sony, Nikon, and Leica camera bodies, so no need for adapters. Finally, number six, let's beat this dead horse a little bit more, the price. I mean, come on. So those are my thoughts on the lens. If you want a really, really good and in-depth breakdown on the specs and performance of this lens, then I highly recommend the review from Christopher Frost's YouTube channel. Not only does he go way more in depth than I do, but he also has a lovely accent. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, everybody. We'll see you on the next one.